Irene will do the same today. We will send her all of the names of the people who have registered and make sure that you get her handouts. Okay, so without further ado, a couple more housekeeping things. First of all, welcome to our fall gardening series that we are hosting with CSU Extension. If you're unfamiliar with Extension, we are the outreach arm of the university. Our focus, we are all involved in horticulture, and our focus is to provide research-based information that you can use in your everyday life. So we hope that these gardening webinars help you be a more successful gardener. We know it is tough to garden in Colorado. Both Tony and Irene will vigorously shake their heads to that. We have had a very unusual summer, we'll just say that too. So we know it's tough, and we hope that we can provide you with some great information. We would encourage you to reach out to your local extension office if you have particular questions that we are unable to answer today. Your local extension office can be found by a quick Google search. If you just do CSU Extension and then type in your county, you'll find your county's contact information. Our couple other housekeeping things, sorry Irene, I keep like getting you ready and then I stop. Should we have an incident with Zoom or we don't feel comfortable about the security, we will immediately stop the meeting. We will then rejoin in a few minutes after we stop the meeting. We just want to make sure that security is okay. That's why it's really important that we know who you are. We will also have the chat disabled during most of Irene's presentation, except when she takes question breaks. We find that sometimes the chat can get very distracting to people, and so we will ask that you only ask questions about the topic involved. And I will say with Zoom, there isn't an easy way to share the chat feature, so we will be unable to share the chat feature with you. You will get a recording of the actual presentation and the live recording, but we cannot share the chat feature with you. Make sure that your cameras are turned off. Make sure that you are muted to avoid distractions. And I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Irene Shonle to you. She is the Horticulture Program Associate, aka Horticulture Agent for El Paso County Extension. She previously had worked as the director for Gilpin County, so up in the mountains, and then made the trek a little bit south to Colorado Springs. And we are thrilled she's here to talk about edible native plants. She is a wealth of knowledge. Natives are her thing. So you are in for a great treat today. So I will stop sharing, and thank you, Irene, for joining us today, and thanks to everybody who's on this call.
All right, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Allison. And you can see my screen, correct?
Sure can, yes.
Okay, great. So now that you all know what I look like, I am going to also turn off my video just for bandwidth's sake. So, but now you know what I look like. So anyway, so today we are going to be talking about edible native plants. And one of the reasons that edible native plants are great is that by being native, they are adapted to Colorado weather. So unlike peaches, which can be problematic, or even a lot of apple crops were lost this year, spring frosts are a little bit less of an issue, and just some of our other vagaries of Colorado weather are a little bit less of an issue. Native plants may not require water, so that's something that's really good. Although in almost every instance, if you do some irrigation, it will increase your production, especially when we have extended dry periods. And also there's usually fewer soil amendments that are required, which is great. If you don't want to go and try to amend your entire yard, you may not have to amend your soil at all. Although again, depending on your soil, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, in some cases, amendments could be helpful, particularly organic matter, which is always a good thing in Colorado soils. Native edible plants also will provide landscape interests, so it's not just something that you can eat, but you can actually use it. So it's sort of like a little bit of a preview for the edible landscaping class that's coming up. They're fantastic for providing food for wildlife. So if you don't really want to eat them, a lot of these will do double duty for birds and other wildlife. And the one thing I do want to say is that a lot of people, there's a lot of interest in foraging for edible native plants. And I really don't recommend that we do that, simply because wild animals are having a tough enough go as it is, especially with all the fires and the drought and other kinds of things. We as humans can go down to the grocery store and buy food, whereas the wild animals require that that food to be there in the wild for them. And so if we go out and we wild collect and we forage for the native edibles, then we're depriving the bear, the deer, the birds from being able to eat that. So I really, really recommend that you grow these edible native plants rather than going out and buying them. And because native edible plants are good for wildlife, one of the things that you do need to think about if you're very successful in growing some of these plants, you do have to think about protecting them from critters, particularly if you are growing them for yourself to harvest rather than growing for the wildlife. And so, and one of the things about growing native plants is, there is the native birds and squirrels and other things really can see those native plants because they're used to looking for them. And so they actually do recognize them easily and will go for that. So they will compete with you for these plants. And so think about if you want to grow it, if you want to eat it yourself, putting something like a netting on shrubs or on wild strawberries, or creating even like a mesh cage like you have here, if you have, a fairly, a bigger crop that you want to grow. And then, so another thing that always comes up, especially with edible native plants, is the concept of cultivars. So we have what we call a straight species, and then we have cultivars. So a cultivar is simply a plant that has been selected, and so it can either come from something, like a naturally occurring sport found in the wild, and then brought in because somebody saw it and was like, wow, I really want to propagate that plant. Or a cultivar can actually be created through a breeding program. And usually a cultivar has some characteristic that that people want. So it's either like better flavor or heavier fruit set or greater, a different leaf color, something like that. So it's very different than the straight species, or it's different than the straight species, and then is usually clonally propagated in order to preserve that characteristic. And you can tell a straight species versus a cultivar is because the cultivars are usually named in quotes. So for example, the golden currant Ribes aureum would have, if it was a selection, the Gwen's buffalo berry selection, that would appear in quotes after. So varieties always have, or cultivars always have a name associated with them. So the straight species in this particular case would be the Ribes aureum, the golden currant, and then the selection, the cultivar, would be the Gwen's buffalo berry. So, and then the other question is, if you're interested in growing cultivars because you want to be growing more, native plants in order to, help wildlife, help pollinators, all of that, the question always arises: are they as valuable as the straight species? Is a cultivar as valuable as a species? And it kind of depends. If some cases they're very similar, and you could easily be propagating them in your home landscape and feel like it'll have the same ecosystem services. But you certainly don't want to be using cultivars if you're trying to do a restoration project, just because there's not a lot of genetic variation, because most of them are clonally propagated. And I'm actually going to take questions right here because this is always a confusing part. So before I move on to anything else, I want to see if people have questions about any of that part yet.
Okay, everybody, the chat is open. If you have anything, you're welcome to type it into the chat and we'll see.
Okay, all right, so I see the, what is a nativar? And so that is the same thing. So a nativar is just a fancier term for a cultivar of a native plant. So Gwen's buffalo berry would be a nativar. So it's just, you know, so cultivar is the bigger category, and a nativar is a cultivar of a native plant. And then are plant select the same as cultivars? So most plant select plants are cultivars because they do, you know, it's a way to sort of be able to get the patent on a plant. And so usually the plant select, you know, have names, and they are a selection. So, and not all plant selections are native either, just by the way, but most of them are cultivars. And then we have the question, is there a type of bird netting that won't trap birds? That can be problematic. And so sometimes you might want to, you know, like sometimes the ones that are a little bit finer won't trap the birds, but that can be a problem. And so then people will often put like little mylar, you know, flags or other kinds of things, but it can be a challenge. Yeah, so the bird netting, you know, keeping birds off is pretty tricky. Okay, next question is it best to cultivate from wild, from a cutting, or from a seed or stone or root? That would really depend on what you're talking about. And again, you can't just go out and collect from the wild without permits and other kinds of things. And so, so taking even seeds in a lot of, like in the national forest or a lot of other open spaces is not permitted. But it would depend on if you do have the permit, it would depend on what species you're talking about. But usually a seed is better. I would never recommend collecting a root from the wild, just because you are doing a lot more disturbance. Unless it's going to be some sort of situation where somebody is, you know, putting a new pathway in, and you know, you can, and the plant is going to get dug up anyway. But otherwise I would never dig a plant in the wild. Next question is, can you plant straight and cultivars together if growing for animals? Yes, you can, just as long as they have the same requirements, you know. So, and if you're talking about, like, you could plant straight Ribes aureum golden currant next to a Gwen's buffalo berry, and that would be fine. And then the next question is, I mentioned clonal propagation. Do cultivars produce viable seed? Cultivars often will produce viable seed, but it may not be that with the same characteristics that make them the cultivars. So let's just say that you liked the cultivar, you know, like you liked the characteristics of Gwen buffalo berry. If you then planted the seeds from that, it may not come up with the same kinds of cultivar type characteristics. So here, Judith is saying, from an article in Mother Earth, she learned about buying cheap lace gardens at Goodwill and using clothespins. So it worked much better than netting, where I caught a neighbor's cat killed 2 birds. Oh yeah, so that would be really bad. You don't really want to be killing birds while you're doing that. So, and then keeping chipmunks out of the netting. So maybe trying the lace curtains. I have not tried that before, but and it depends on, you know, with the wildlife, it also depends on how high up. If it's more of a taller bush, probably the chipmunks aren't going to be, you know, getting as high. They don't tend to climb too much. So, okay, so let's go ahead and move on. If you want to deactivate the chat again. So with cultivars in particular, you do have to think about cross-pollination. And so if you are using named cultivars, it actually is better to have, for fruit production, to actually have 2 different kinds of cultivars, or a cultivar in a straight species for best production of fruit, just because 2 cultivars, it's basically like self-pollinating. So if you had 2 individuals of Gwen's buffalo berry next to each other, that would basically be like having one very large shrub. And so you do want to have, you will get better pollination or better fruit set if you do have 2 different cultivars, or a cultivar and a straight species. So the first one I want to talk about today is serviceberry, Amelanchier ulnifolia. This is a beautiful plant that has white flowers in the springtime, and then it has these blue berries that occur during the summertime that are quite tasty, and birds also love them. So this is one of the ones that you're definitely going to fight the birds over. And then it has a bonus of having a beautiful fall color. So I consider this to be a really great ornamental shrub in your garden, as well as a good food producer. They are hardy up to 10,000 feet, so pretty much anybody who's listening today should be able to grow them. Mostly we find them above 6,000 feet, and as you see here, that they're mostly on a west slope distribution, but we do see them in some cases in the eastern slope. You will get the best berries with full sun and a moist and acidic to neutral soil, but you know they are native plants, and so you will still do just fine if they grow in more native soil. If you do mulch them, you will not have to irrigate them as much, and also if you're higher in elevation, you won't need to water them as much, because typically they're found at a little bit higher elevations, and so the cooler nights and a little bit higher greater precipitation at higher elevations means that you don't have to water them as much. They'll grow anywhere from 6 feet tall to 15 feet tall, and they'll start producing fruit around 2 to 4 years old. And while they are self-fertile, they will produce better with two. So again, if you have a cultivar here, get 2 different kinds of cultivars. And because they do have cyanogenic glycosides in the branches, just be aware that if you do have ruminant livestock, you don't want to let them at these because of those glycosides. So the fruit is produced on the previous year's growth, and also even on older wood, but the younger and more vigorous branches are going to produce the best fruit for you. And the fruit is really variable in taste, so it can be very, very mild and to tasting quite tart like a blueberry. So this is one of the ones that, so because it can be so variable, people really do like to create cultivars if you are trying to grow them for your own personal use. And because Canada doesn't do all that well at a lot of the fruits that we would normally, have, like peaches and other kinds of things, because they're just so cold and so north, they have a lot more small fruit production than we do down in the lower 48. And so, so they really have developed a lot of cultivars specifically for fruit production. So some of the best ones are Northline, and that one it's 5 to 7 feet tall, and it will sucker profusely, which can make a really great fruiting hedge for you. And it does have very high yields and is an early bearer, and the fruit is quite flavorful. Smoky is very sweet. It gets to be about 8 to 10 feet tall, and it also has good yields. Other serviceberry cultivars include Regent, which is a more compact version, 4 to 6 feet tall, and it does have pretty flavorful fruit. That's hard to say. And then also Success, which is selected for heavy fruit. You can also find other cultivars just depending on where you're buying them. And, I would just read the description and see if it sounds like it appeals to you. There is also another another species of serviceberry, Amelanchier utah-ensis, the Utah serviceberry. And if you live in a bit of a hotter, drier area, this might be a better choice for you. It is a little bit more adapted to the hot, dry areas. And you can see from its distribution that it really is in that southwest and western slope, which is a hot area. It will ultimately get 10 to 12 feet tall by 8 to 10 feet wide, but it's pretty slow growing, which is typical for plants that are adapted to hot, dry areas. And it will go from about 5,000 to 9,000 feet, so it doesn't have quite the same elevation, the top elevation range. And it has pretty good drought resistance. So if you are looking for an edible native plant for your garden, but you don't really want to be watering it that much, and you just kind of want more of an ornamental for good wildlife, this would be a good choice for that. All right, and I actually might, no, I'll just go for a couple more, and then I'll stop for some questions at that point. So the next one is American plum, Prunus americana. This has beautiful, fragrant white flowers in the springtime, and these have some of the most wonderful fragrance, in my personal opinion, in the plant world. So you may feel different, but I really think they're fantastic. Great for pollinators. So they're one of the earlier shrubs to bloom. So this is really valuable for those early pollinators when they're first coming out. But then it also does produce a plum that ranges in color from yellowish to reddish to purple, depending on the individual. These are hardy to about 8,000 feet, although I found that they don't tend to produce a lot of plums above 7,500, even in a warm microclimate. And so the higher up you go, you might get some flowers, but you're probably not going to get plums. And make sure as you go up higher, higher than about 7,000 feet, that you put it in a really nice, warm, south-facing microclimate. The plums will grow on very poor soils. They're very drought tolerant. But again, if you're really looking to maximize your production, you do want to amend with organic soil amendments and supplement with water. The plum does prefer full sun, although it can tolerate a little bit of shade. And again, it will form a thicket, which is pretty nice if you are trying to, fill in a space or provide a ornamental fruiting hedge. Plums are susceptible to black knot disease. So this is what that looks like, and that can just be pruned out. And then the fruit, just like with the service berry, they can vary a lot from being kind of bland to very tart, but they make really good preserves and tarts, and pretty much always need sweeteners. So this is not something that you're just going to be eating out of hand, like some of our more cultivated plums. All right, I'll do chokecherry and then I'll take some questions. So then chokecherry is, and I have never seen any selections, any cultivars of the American plum. So as far as I know, you just got to go with the straight species. So chokecherry is Prunus or Potus virginiana, depending on whose taxonomy you follow. Has fragrant white flowers in the springtime that are also really good for pollinators. It blooms a little bit after the plum. It will develop shiny black berries in the late summer to early fall, and then again a beautiful red fall coloration. So this is a great plant again for multi-season interest, and really good as a fruiting hedge. These are hardy to about 9,000 feet, and will do fine. It'll grow anywhere from 6 feet to 15 feet tall, and you will see them taller and more productive in areas with a little bit of extra moisture. So you will often see them in riparian areas, and that's where you will see just lots and lots of food production or fruit production. And particularly you want to be, if you're going to be growing these and you kind of want to reduce your water needs, make sure that you're giving them good water during the spring vegetative growth, and then also again during the fall fruit bud set. The chokecherries will grow in poor soils, but again, with a little bit of organic matter, they will produce more chokecherries. They'll produce the most in full sun, but they'll actually tolerate and flower even with almost full shade. So this is a plant that you can grow in the shade. And just like the service berries, they can be toxic to the ruminant livestock, so they can produce cyanogenic glycosides if eaten. Some of the problems that chokecherries have, again, we have the black knot like we did with the American plum. They're in the same genus. They can get powdery mildew, particularly if they're in a more shady area. And they can also get tent caterpillars. So this is very common for the chokecherries. And this can just be pruned out if you're concerned about it, or you can just let it go. It's rare that the tent caterpillars will actually cause enough damage to truly harm them. Sometimes they can get leaf curl aphids and other kinds of things. Now, the one thing you want to be really aware of is the suckering habit of a chokecherry. So most chokecherries, and if you can see here in this picture, so here's the chokecherry, and it wants to grow as sort of a suckering thicket. And so if you try to grow it in a lawn, it'll look beautiful, but then it will keep throwing up these suckers. And so you'll have to be constantly dealing with them. So this isn't really the optimal way to grow a chokecherry. It's much better to grow it as you intend to have it as a more of a suckering thicket. There is a brand new chokecherry out. It's called Sucker Punch, and that is Scott Scorbo produces, and I believe this may be a Plant Select selection now. I am not positive, but it is a non-suckering chokecherry. So that is something, if you really like the chokecherry but you don't want the suckers, that would be something to look for. So it does produce fruit after about 3 to 5 years, and it's very, very stringent, which is why it's called chokecherry. So it's particularly if it's underripe, it gets a little bit sweeter after a frost or two. But you can also just pick it and then make jams or pies or syrup or even wine with it. There are, so the only cultivar that I'm aware of is Schubert's Red, which is a selection out of Canada, where it's selected for the leaf color, so the purple leaf color. So this is a very popular tree, and you'll often see it planted, you know, in people's yards, and you'll often see the suckers all around their yards as they plant it. But so the leaves emerge green, and then they turn a purple red as they get with age. All right, so I'm going to stop here and take any questions on those. So if you want to activate the chat.
And the chat is open for those who have questions for Irene on this section. Another reminder, while you are typing in your questions, please, please, please keep your videos off. It is less distracting to everyone and saves our bandwidth as well.
Whoops. Okay, so let's see. All right, Melissa's asking if one gets black knot, can you still eat the berries? Absolutely, it just will make the tree less productive, and again, you can just prune it out. So it's nothing. It's not something that affects the actual edible fruit, but it's going to definitely make your tree or your shrub not as happy. How do you identify these species of berries? So that would be, you know, you'd have to sort of learn to, you know, there are various different books that have them and pictures and other kinds of things. One of the things I will say for sure, particularly if you're out in the wild, is never, never, never eat a berry that you do not absolutely 100% know the identification of, because that's a good way to die. So just make sure that you do that. But I mean, there's classes, like there's the Colorado Native Plant Master classes that will often, you know, go with shrubs. So it's kind of just, you know, like there's a variety of different resources. You know, you can also go to garden centers and start looking at the tags on the plants and then look at them. So, okay, so then the question is, does shadblow serviceberry have edible fruit? Yeah, so shadblow is just a kind, so usually shadblow refers to also the Amelanchier alnifolia, although in the eastern part of the United States, it can also be Amelanchier levis or some of the other ones, but all of the Amelanchiers do have edible fruit. All right, for the prunes, does flavor vary on the same tree or between trees? So it's usually flavor varies between the trees. So one, or the plums, you know, between the shrubs, it will be one shrub will be, you know, tart, and then the next one will be, you know, maybe a little bit sweeter or blander. So it does vary between the trees. And then Asta says, I absolutely love serviceberry, highly recommend. Yes, I'm totally with you there. Is there a risk with chokecherry or serviceberry to pets? So it's really more of a problem with the ruminant livestock. So I would not say that you know, you should have a problem unless you have a sheep as a pet. Are similar looking berries toxic if you mistakenly identify them? You don't ever want to eat a berry you don't know, period. Is a serviceberry a Saskatoon? Yes, so now we're seeing all the common names. So yes, Saskatoon, serviceberry, Juneberry, shadblow. There's probably other ones too, but yeah, so there's all these different berries are all called serviceberry. So this is one of the reasons that it's actually good to become friends with Latin names, because Amelanchier alnifolia will get you to the serviceberry you want every time. Okay, so please clarify the scientific name of chokecherry. Okay, I would have to check. So right now, you know, there's a lot of taxonomic changes being made, and I would have to look at and see what Ackerfield, and so maybe if I can try to look and get back to it, but I, at least in some people's taxonomy, it is Potus virginiana, but all of the taxonomy is in flux and it varies depending on who is doing the flora. So, so that is, okay, so now I just said how great scientific names were, and now you're seeing the complication of scientific names because things do change. But one of the things with scientific names is you can always trace it back to you know, figure out what the synonyms are and all of that. So, okay. So then, let's see, Ellen is asking, are these easily found in regional nurseries? So yes, so far everything that I've talked about should be found in regional nurseries. I'm not trying to have any completely wacky plants that, you know, it would be very hard to find. Some of the cultivars you may have some troubles finding in regional nurseries, particularly with the serviceberry cultivars. So if you're really interested in some of those serviceberry cultivars, you might want to order online. And then the last question is, when is the best time to plant a serviceberry? And so you can plant it in I would say either spring or fall will be the best time. And fall can actually be a really friendly time to plant it. Maybe not if you're at above 7,000 feet, but if you're on the, you know, sort of front range or, you know, anywhere in the lower elevations, fall can be a really good time to plant it because the nights are getting cooler and it's a little bit less of a challenging time to do it. Okay, yeah, so so here we have Ackerfield calls it Prunus virginiana variation melanocarpa, and it again, taxonomies, you know, so if you look at Weber, it's one thing. If you look at Ackerfield, it's another thing. So, so there's a lot of different interpretations of things, and sometimes Ackerfield is different than the flora of North America, and different from, you know, William Weber's flora of, you know, so it does change a little bit, but you can always trace it back. The next question is, can Americans import serviceberries from Canada? I believe that you can, because I do think that they have a phytosanitary certificate, and you can, but whether they'll, you know, ship it for sure, but I have seen some of them available for shipping. Okay, I'm going to move on if you want to disactivate the chat again. Okay, so the next one is Western sand cherry, Prunus speciae. And this is another great little plant. It has white flowers in the springtime, very similar to the American plum, the Prunus americana. So they have similar fragrance and similar beauty. It's a bit of a smaller shrub, and it's more found on more distributed on the eastern slope. And the fruit will make excellent juice or jams, jellies, syrup, all of that. And you can eat it fresh. So unlike a lot of the American plum, you know, you can actually just eat it out of hand, or you can dry it. But it's just like a regular cherry, you do have a pit problem. The Western sand cherry does like full sun, and it is a nice hardy plant, so it'll be hardy from zones 3 to 8. And it's very adaptable and drought tolerant, which is awesome. And it is self-pollinating, but again, you will have more fruit with cross-pollination. So either 2 different individuals of the straight species, or a straight species and a named cultivar. And it will sometimes get, you know, brown rot, which both the fruit and vegetation have a problem. It'll get black knot like the plum. It'll get plum curculio, leaf spot, and or powdery mildew. So, you know, like all fruits, there can be issues. There are 2 cultivars, Hansen's bush cherry, which gets to be about 4 to 5 feet tall, and then the Pawnee Butte sand cherry, which is a plant selection, which it's a much shorter plant, so it's more of a ground cover plant. So it's only 5 to 18 inches tall, but it spreads over a pretty wide area. And then we do actually have wild strawberries, so Fragaria vesca. So these are great little ground cover plants with the bonus of having some very tasty little tiny berries. And this can be a really good ground cover for sort of moist shade. You may not get a lot of fruit production, but it will make a good a good ground cover. And the straight species is hardy to zone 1. So there's nobody here that it would be too high in elevation to grow it. It does prefer a little bit of extra organic matter in the soil if possible. And it'll take anywhere from a half-day sun to a full-day sun. Again, it will be a ground cover in full shade, but if you want to have the fruits, then you want to give it at least a half-day sun. And if you want to be, developing, having good fruit production, then do water when the soils are dry. And you can mulch with straw, which will also keep the berries from, getting rotted on the soil. Some cultivars, so there are some pretty serious taxonomic confusion with some of the cultivars in the alpine strawberries. And whether they truly are from Fragaria vesca or not, it's pretty murky there, because a lot of these plants that do get selected, kind of go back in time a long ways, and it's a little bit confusing, and so it's not clear whether all of these are truly Fragaria vesca cultivars. But anyway, Rugen and Mignonette have been selected for improved taste and yield, but that you also lose out on the hardiness with those. But they are quite tasty. And then we do have wild raspberries, so the Rubus idea subspecies melanolaceus. And these will, grow in wild in a lot of different places in Colorado. They usually are found in areas where, sort of slightly wetland areas or riparian areas, or someplace where you get a little extra moisture. So you can find wild raspberries and grow them in your yard if you've got slightly acidic, but it doesn't have to be all that acidic, but well-amended soils, and make sure that they get good water while they're flowering and fruiting if you want to have good production. Good to fertilize them in the springtime if you want best production, and you will definitely get best production in full sun, yet with moister feet. And the fruit is very, very tasty. If you ever do go hiking, it's always good to snatch a couple of raspberries, again, leaving the rest of them for the bird. But you can also make a really good tea from the leaves if you are growing them in your yard. So there's many, many cultivars. So most of our cultivated raspberries do come from the Rubus idaeus. They are selected from originally that wild type stock. And so you can look at our fact sheet raspberries for the home garden to see all the different kinds of cultivars. Fall bearing is probably best if you're going to grow raspberries. And we're not going to get into, so don't type in a whole bunch of raspberry questions, particularly on the cultivated side, because that's a whole different class on growing fruit, and we don't have time to get into that. So please don't go there in the chat. All right, the next one is golden currant, Ribes aureum. And I really like this shrub. This is, again, has many seasons of interest. It's got yellow flowers in the springtime, which are a really great substitute for forsythias. Then they produce a berry, which can vary depending, again, on the individual, from a reddish color when it's ripe to a purple. And then it develops a really clear and gorgeous fall color. So there is definitely some taxonomic confusion, particularly if you are buying nursery stock with Ribes odoratum. So most of the ones that you get in nurseries are fragrant, and they actually have this beautiful clove fragrance, which I love. But those may be all actually Ribes odoratum, which are native more to the east of us. So maybe native to the very eastern part of Colorado, but certainly into Kansas and Nebraska. But then there also may be, and maybe not, and this is, I think, this is something that just has to be sorted out at some point because it's really not straight. But so a lot of the Ribes aureum, if it's, just not a subspecies, but just Ribes aureum, they're not particularly fragrant, or they're only very lightly fragrant. The Ribes aureum subspecies villosum, maybe, the fragrant variety, and it actually may be Ribes odoratum. So this is a mess. So if you're trying to buy a plant in the nursery, or if you're trying to buy a plant, golden currant, and you want it to have that beautiful clove fragrance, then either get a named variety, one of the cultivars, or buy it when it's in bloom. They will grow anywhere from 3 to 5 feet tall, and they will grow in poor and dry soils, but again, will produce the most fruit in soils that are amended with organic matter and with some extra water. They will grow in full sun, but they can be in part shade. And the fruit, again, varies pretty widely. It's tart to sweet, and it usually is full flavored, which is also code for some people find it a little bit more flavored than they want it to be. Also, do note that it's the alternate host of the white pine blister rust. So cultivars, again, as we talked about in the beginning, Gwen's buffalo currant. And this one is, again, about 3 to 5 feet tall. It is selected for its improved fruiting habit. So if you do want to be producing a golden currant for your own use, or even for the birds, this would be a good choice. And this one does have that clove fragrance, and it also has excellent fall color. There's also the Crandall clove currant, which is said to be a cultivar of Ribes odoratum, which may be Ribes aureum subspecies villosum. So the Crandall, this one's a little bit bigger, and again, it does have that really great clove fragrance in the springtime, and a good fruit set, and again, just that red fall color. The Crandall, it has also, in addition, resistance to the white pine blister rust and powdery mildew. So that might be a good choice for the home garden. Creeping Mahonia, this one is, only known usually to foragers in terms of being an edible plant, but it actually is one. It's really a great ornamental plant. It has yellow honey smelling flowers in the springtime, evergreen leaves that kind of turn a little bit bronzy red in the wintertime. And then it does produce blue berries, which are, you could eat or you can leave for wildlife. And the great thing about the Mahonia repens is that it will grow in the dry shade of conifers, which is a hard place to grow plants. So that dry shade doesn't need any soil amendment. It can take dry soils, but it can be challenging to get it established, particularly past that first winter. So, you might want to try a larger plant, or putting a floating row cover or a mulch on it to protect it from wind that first winter. So if you do want to eat the fruit, you certainly can. It was eaten in, the pioneer times. It's a little on the bland side, but if you add a little, lemon and sugar, it actually can make some pretty decent preserves. Woods rose is one of our largest roses, and it has lovely pink fragrant flowers in the springtime, yellowish to orangish fall color, and then it produces hips in the wintertime. It will grow in poor dry soils, but it'll also do better in moist, with a little bit extra moisture and organic matter. And then it might become a little bit more enthusiastic than you'd like it to be. So this is one that is kind of maybe a good choice if you have a lot of space, or if you want to have a thorny hedge that would be good for wildlife and also be attractive. The hips are produced after the flowers bloom, but they're not really you're not going to just eat them. So you can make tea, rose hip tea out of them, or make jams from the fruit or the hips. Next one is silver buffalo berry, and this is a plant that has male and female on separate species. This is a great choice to replace a Russian olive, which is on the state noxious weed list. It has a very similar gray-green foliage, but the female plants also produce these very beautiful red berries, and so this can be a really nice choice. Again, if you're kind of feeling sad about replacing a Russian olive. It's pretty hardy to zone 3, kind of ranges in height from 6 to 15 feet tall. And you do need both the male and the female plants if you want to have fruit set. It's a nitrogen fixture, which is kind of unusual. So it actually can be beneficial to the landscape. And it's pretty drought tolerant, but again, it will grow and produce better with some moisture. The fruit is pretty tart, and the birds will get to it before you do. But usually these red colored fruits are very attractive to birds, and they will eat it before we think it's good. We will think it's good after a few frosts. Birds will think it's good earlier than that. So just be aware of that. And then also be aware that the raw fruit can contain saponin, which is just a soapy kind of substance, and that actually can taste quite bitter. But if you cook it, it goes away. Next one is three-lobed sumac, so Rus trilobata. It's also known as skunk bush because the leaves do kind of have a skunky flavor to, or skunky smell to them. I don't think it's a really bad smell, but I think some people are pretty sensitive to it. It has sort of inconspicuous yellow flowers in the springtime, but they're very good for bee pollination. And then it will develop a tart red fruit later on, which is edible to humans and also very attractive to birds. And then it will turn a nice orange to red fall color in the fall. So it's a good, very low water ornamental plant. It can get up to 8 feet tall, although you usually see it more on the 3 to 5 foot range. It's very drought tolerant. And it's most typically used for edible plants as a sort of lemonade substitute. So you can actually make sumac lemonade, but you can also use it in Middle Eastern cooking where it's called za'atar. And I'll take questions after this hazelnut. So this is just going to be a quick one, but we do have a native hazelnut here in Colorado, and it's called the beaked hazelnut. It grows anywhere from about 5,000 to 8,000 foot. It is kind of an ice age relic, so it's not very commonly found in Colorado, and you will always find it in a riparian area where there are still some ice age relics found. But you might be able to, if you probably, so this one, whoever asked about the regional nurseries, this one probably will be hard to find in regional nurseries, but I did want people to know that it is available. And this is there's male and female plants, and only the female plants will bear nuts. It requires both male and female plants. And it's not going to be a plant where you're going to be getting a ton of hazelnuts. So this would be more just for the cool factor. All right, questions?
The chat is open if you have any questions. Sorry, now the chat is open. Oh. I thought I clicked, but I forgot. I didn't get the right click.
Got it.
Oh, geez. Like, or Tony and I canceled each other. I'm not sure. Okay, there's some questions for you, Irene.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, all right. So the next question is about Japanese beetles. So that they love the foliage and fruit of raspberries, plums, and other stone fruit plants. Are any of the native fruit types particularly resistant to Japanese beetles? In my experience, I have to say that I so far have zero experience with Japanese beetles because I moved from Gilpin County at 9,000 feet where they don't exist. And now I am in the Colorado Springs, Canyon City area where they haven't gotten down to yet. So I cannot answer that question. So I don't know, but is anyone else in Japanese beetle land have any experience with that? I know it's just a matter of time before I'm going to be putting up with Japanese beetles, but so far.
Irene, I'm having trouble getting the chat to stay open? For some reason. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, well, maybe if you can get it open, then just leave it open for now because, it's getting.
Yeah, I'm trying, but it keeps on reverting back to default.
Okay. Well, I'm going to just move on then. And then you just work on it. The chat will stay open for the rest of class. I will still only answer questions periodically because it is getting, time is drawing to a close. So I'll let you work on that. Okay, so the next one is juniper. So we've got, various different junipers here. The Juniper scopularum is a very low-growing ground cover. It will tolerate very poor soils. It will also do full sun, but it'll also take part shade. And then you can use the berries in gin if you make your own gin, or also to flavor meats. Pinyon pine is, the classic, edible pine, which is actually, you can see it even in the name, Pinus edulis, which means edible. And so this is the tree that's more typically found in New Mexico, but you can also see that it has a pretty wide distribution in southern Colorado and on the western slope. It's really happy in well-drained soils. It's an extremely drought-tolerant tree, and the nuts are very tasty, but you're gonna have to wait and be patient because they're not gonna bear any nuts until 20 to 25 years. Prickly pear, so this is getting out there, but this is actually a pretty cool thing for people who are adventurous. So the prickly pear is opuntia, and it does prefer full sun, has to be in full sun to produce fruit and well-drained soils. But the fruit, which are also known as tunas, you can use them, harvest them, and use them for juice. So they actually make really good drinks, jellies or syrup, and you just burn off the little thorns if it's a thorny type. And the tip is that the Opuntia phaeacantha is the one that has the heaviest set of the fruit along our area. So that's going to be the best species for fruit set. But even if you have a kind that is not as good for the fruit set, you can actually cook the pads, which are called nopales, and they can be used in salads or enchiladas, tacos. So for those of you who like more of the true Mexican style cooking, these can be an awesome addition. Bee balm, Monarda fistulosa, is a great plant for full sun or very light shade. And it's, it's a pretty drought tolerant plant, a lot more drought tolerant than a lot of the garden varieties. And it will tolerate poor soils, but again, it will, probably look the best with a little bit more organic matter. But the leaves can be used as an oregano replacement if you're wanting a more pollinator-friendly oregano replacement. Anise hyssop is another herb that can be used in, you can use the leaves for a tea, and the flowers are edible if you want to put them in salads. And it will grow 3 to 4 feet tall, but it's pretty drought tolerant, and it does prefer full sun. I'm just going to try to bomb through these, and then I'm going to get to the questions. So we also have a variety of wild onions, and these, again, I would not recommend to collect from the wild because you're just going to be digging up the roots. So if you can grow these, and I have found them for sale in various catalogs. This is Allium textile. This is Allium cernum, the nodding onion. And you use the bulbs like you would, like a small onion. You can also use the foliage like you would chives. The flowers are edible like chives. They're very drought tolerant. They will spread a little bit by seeds. So it's a really nice plant, again, like an ornamental that you can use, and you can eat, and it also is good for pollinators. And then, so then for the people who are really, really adventurous, you can get into some more of the I would say these are for the dedicated foragers, but Rocky Mountain bee plant, which also has a kind of skunky smell to it. It's an annual, but you can boil the young sprouts. I mean, I would say you'd kind of have to be desperate for this, but the young seed pods actually have a spicy flavor. It's in the same family as capers come from. Or you could grind the mature seeds into a flour. And showy milkweed. I mean, so normally we think of this as a great butterfly and ornamental plant, but you can eat this. And again, I really don't recommend that you go out and forage any wild milkweed. We need to leave those for the butterflies. But if you're growing it on your own property, you can, so it's a great plant to grow for butterflies on your own property. Likes full sun. Prefers moist soils, but it is a fairly drought tolerant plant. And you can actually eat the flowers, the buds, and the young seed pods. I'm not sure I would eat any of these, but this actually can be. And this is something, this is a quote, "When properly prepared, this is one of our most enjoyable and versatile edible species. Who knew? But don't eat them raw because they are poisonous." So you can make the flowers into a syrup. You can use the young shoots like asparagus and the young seed pods like okra. So there you go. This is some ones that you want to make sure that you're not eating. So our native elderberry, the Sambucus microboitres, is considered by some people to be poisonous, although you get a lot of range of recommendations. Some people do say that it actually isn't poisonous. Some people say as long as you cook it, it's fine. Just given that there are some reports out there that it is poisonous, I would stay away from it and just grow a cultivated garden variety rather than eating this and leave these for the birds. And this one will kill you, the baneberry, so Actea rubra, and it looks nice and tasty there, and it will kill you dead. So you want to be sure that you're avoiding that. So if you do want to get some recipes for some of these, there's a book put out by the Colorado State Forest Service, the Fruits of Your Labor Cookbook. And some other resources would include Edible and Medicinal Plants of the Rockies, Best Tasting Wild Plants of Colorado and the Rockies, Rocky Mountain Berry Book, and Edible Native Plants of the Rocky Mountains. And again, please don't go out and forage the plants. Our wild animals are really struggling. And so grow these at home. Use this information to decide what you would like to grow and then grow it in your house. Okay, I think that is the end. Yep, so I'm gonna now scroll up and see what the questions are. Okay, it looks like now we actually are. So
yeah, there's a whole bunch. Yeah. Sorry about that, Irene.
Yeah, that's all right. So how to differentiate false strawberries? So, so false strawberry, it would not be natively growing. So that may be a weed around, but it doesn't have, it certainly would never be producing fruit. And so I'm not sure if I could come up with a really easy way to say that, but if, I would say that if you can get the wild strawberry, like buy it, then that would be easier to find. But if you're getting it from somebody's, getting it from a neighbor or, from your own yard, usually, if you see the strawberries, you see that. Okay, so Judith asks, how does one ID the gender of the hazelnut? So it's always a trick to be able to sex a plant when it's not in flower. And so often you're buying them when they're pretty young, and so you wouldn't be able to know that. And so either you'd have to wait to buy them when they're old and fruiting, or you would have to just buy a number of them and then hope that you have a nice mix of both male and female. The next question is, what is the rose name again? It's Rosa woodsii. So like woods, like the forest, woodsii. And then the next one, so how do I encourage establishment of Mahonia repens after a poor first year? I would say if you did get them to survive for the first winter, you're actually going to it will start to fill in. So I would just say that, giving them a little bit of extra water and some mulch around them would be helpful. And then, but just, just give them a little extra water and some mulch. All right, next question is, how well will sand cherry do in a health strip, and how aggressively do they spread via suckering? So the sand cherry actually could do pretty well in a health strip because it's native to hot, dry areas. The straight species is tall, so I don't know if your health strip, what you're allowed to have in your health strip, if you're allowed to have something that's 5 feet tall. If you're not, you could try the plant select selection, which is, only on that 15 to 18 inch range. And it does, spread sideways by suckering. I'm not sure, and how aggressively they're going to spread is partly going to depend on your soil and how much water you give them. Okay, the next question, or the next comment is, Japanese beetles also feast on silver buffalo berry leaves. These darn Japanese beetles, that's really a pain. Do raspberries fruit their first year of growth? No. So raspberries have a biennial fruiting pattern, and so they will produce a primocane the first year, and then they'll produce a florocane the second year. So they will only produce fruit in their second year. Are there plants that don't grow well together like raspberry and chokecherries? No, I would not. You know, in fact, actually, in my house in Rollinsville, I had raspberries and chokecherries growing right next to each other, and you know, because they both like that little bit of extra moisture and that full sun. So I would say, as long as you are respecting the cultural needs of the plants, that you could plant, you know, whatever plants together. So, but if they're both plants that like a little extra water and full sun, then you can plant those two together. But what you don't want to do is plant a really drought tolerant plant, let's say you know, one of the cactus next to something that really wants a little bit of extra water, like the hazelnut, just for example. Those would not grow well together. Okay, so then do these plants fruit on old or new wood, and when is the best time to trim or prune? So most of these plants will fruit on last year's wood, so you don't want to be pruning anything after they flower. Or I mean, you know, like if you're going to prune right after they flower. So like the chokecherries or the serviceberry, they're going to produce on you know, this year's growth. And so if you were to prune in the fall or winter, you'd be pruning off all of the bud set for next year. So, and so it's often better to, if you're going to trim or prune, to prune back you know, like an older branch that is no longer all that productive. And so just prune it all the way down, even to the ground or to the main trunk, depending on when that is. You know, and if you have a structural issue, you can prune anytime you want. If you want to just kind of shape it, you know, you can prune it, and you don't really care so much about the fruit set, and you really just want to, you know, change the shape of the plant. You could, you know, do that in the late winter or early spring. Okay, if you want to propagate ribes aureum from a cutting, when is the best time to do that? I do not know the answer to that. I have never tried to propagate it from a cutting, so that would be something I'd have to look up. And Tony, you have mad Google skills, so maybe you could check that out, because I do not know the answer. All right, and now we have another Japanese, they ate the leaves on the serviceberry. Oh, those Japanese beetles. Go out in the morning with a bowl of soapy water. Yeah, I mean, so it just depends on how many Japanese beetles you have. It's pretty tough. What do you recommend for pruning of these berry-laden species? So what, I'm not sure, Sandy, what do you recommend? Like loppers or pruners? Is that what do you recommend? Like I would say if it's not a thick branch thing, you could just do like a Felco type pruner, just a, you know, garden pruners. And if they're already a thick, you know, if you're pruning back a really, you know, thick trunk, you know, one of the sort of, then you might need to get a heavier lopper. And if you're not harvesting, do you leave the berries indefinitely? Yes. Yeah, so if you're not going to eat them yourself, just leave them up there for the birds. The birds will come and get them at some point, and they'll be very happy for you to have done that. Next question is, are all agastaches edible? No. So some of the cultivars, I mean, none of them are toxic, but I would not say that all of them are good. I would say that the agastache funiculum is the best for eating. And so not all of them would be good. Would I have any book recommendations? So yeah, that was the books that I listed at the end would be the books I would recommend, and I will try to send that out to everybody after this. So Asta says, I've heard some milkweed species are toxic. All milkweed species can be toxic when they're mature, so they have glycosides in them, and it's actually what the monarch butterfly uses to sort of protect it from its predators. And so you would only be eating the milkweed species at a very young age when it's not developing a lot of that, that sort of toxic sap. And again, I'm not sure that I would be eating the milkweeds. I grow milkweeds because I think that they're beautiful and because I like them for the pollinators. And so even though they are edible, I'm not sure, I just wanted to include that because I wanted people to know that you could, eat it if you were growing it yourself. And again, don't go out and forage the wild milkweeds. So where can one buy plants rather than forage? So there's, you can try seeing if, these plants are in nurseries. High Country Gardens has a variety of them. The Colorado Native Plant Society does have a list of, retail and wholesale vendors for different native plants. You can sometimes buy them for seeds. So, I would just start really looking. You can do Google searches. You can, order a lot of these online. All right, and then Brett is asking about, do I have info on goji berries? So they're not native, so they're not really, I'm not going to get into them on this particular talk. What are the identifying characteristics of the wood rose? You have a rose growing on your property like a weed. So it can be tricky. We have 3 species of native roses in Colorado. Woods rose is the biggest rose, and it's probably the most aggressive. So I would imagine that if you, and I don't know, Carla, where you live, but if you live at slightly higher elevations and you have a kind of moist area and it's growing like a weed, it may well be the woods rose. Next question is, when I lived in Montana, one of my favorite plants to forage were thimbleberries. I've heard they grow naturally here, but I've never seen them. Yeah, so there are thimbleberries rarely, and I don't think they're the same species as the one in Montana. So we do have, we do have a species of rubus that is called a thimbleberries, but I'm not sure that it is the same species. And I do only ever find them at high elevations in kind of moist, areas. And so I'm not sure, so in your saying recommendations about growing them, if you can't provide, if you're at a lower elevation and without some, they seem to like shady areas. So if you don't have a lot of moisture, and they do seem to be in acidic soils, so I'm not positive that you're going to be able to replicate the necessary growing conditions here in Colorado. Okay, so Lonnie says Scott Skogerbo recommends cuttings in early spring. I think this is in reference to the golden currant in early spring before bud break for most fruit plants. Okay. So I am not going, you will not get the copy of the whole slideshow. I will give you handouts, but you're not going to get the entire slideshow. Huckleberries are, so we only have, so we do have something in Colorado called Vaccinium scoparium. We have, and they're usually called whortleberries. Huckleberries are more native to the like Montana area, and so far people have not cracked the code on getting them to grow anywhere outside of the wild. And then Jan says there's a huge thimbleberry patch on several hikes up Glenwood Canyon. Not sure if they're still after the Grizzly Gulch fire. Yeah, so I mean, again, like the in that sort of moist areas. But yeah, Glenwood Canyon, that's a little bit lower elevation, so maybe it just needs moist, but I'm not sure. So. All right, and it looks like I got through all of the questions. So thank you all very much for participating. And again, Allison has reshared the upcoming garden webinars, so I hope you get a chance to check some of those out, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Yep, so just a reminder that we have recorded this presentation. We will send you the link, or actually Irene will be sending you the handouts and the link when that's available. We are at the mercy of our IT staff, who, as you can imagine, are extremely busy. So please be patient with that. But if you registered, you will get that information. So Irene, that was absolutely incredible. You're getting tons of kudos in the chat. And we thank you for coming and hope that you can join us next week or in the future.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.